Family business makes no sense. So let's talk about it.
G'day, I'm John Kemfield, the Family Business Solutionist, broadcasting from Melbourne in Australia. We're now getting into the meat of my book titled Family Business Makes No Sense. The basic premise of the book is that if you put a family together with a business, you are asking for trouble and you shouldn't do it. Unless you put a lot of things in place and you do a great many things so that success is achieved through effort and wisdom and knowledge and strong relationships, so that your family business becomes a thing of beauty, becomes the all-conquering entity that so many family businesses have been over the years, as opposed to the 9 out of 10 that are consigned to the trash can of failure, often taking the business, the family, and the family's fortunes down with them. The focus of the book is on conflict and the conflicts that are generated because a family system is in direct conflict to a business system, and if you put them together, they are bound to clash. Now, I've identified in the space of working with hundreds of family businesses as a mediator, as a dispute resolver, and more particularly as a solutionist, simply trying to help them solve their problems and have a happy life, a successful business, and a great family with good relationships. I've identified at least 50 common causes of conflict, and I'm going to talk about them one by one, video by video, under 4 different headings. The first of those is where we are now, which is section 1, personal issues and emotional drivers, because personalities and personal issues tend to lie at the very heart. Beyond that, we'll talk in the succeeding 3 sections. We will be talking about how these personal issues and emotional drivers turn into relationship issues and how the relationship issues become family challenges or business challenges. But for now, let's just frame up the context of the first section, personal issues and emotional drivers. Let's start off by talking about family business conflict. Now, here we're talking about a situation where at least 2 members of a family are working in, on, or in some way in connection with a business, and they may be working together, they may not be working together, they may not be working close to each other physically at all, but something is going on which, as we'll discover, may have a lot to do with historical causes and very little to do with current catalysts. We're going to be looking at what sort of causes may be creating a conflict. Now, conflict requires at least 2 to tango. There must be something or some things that are done that create a significant emotional and or physical reaction in another party. If things are done which may be utterly despicable, but they don't create a reaction, we don't have conflict. We just have an event and maybe something unpleasant that we can poke a stick at. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about when these things, whatever they are, develop into out-and-out conflict, which is a clash of one person against another. The fact that the definition of conflict is so broad and so vague is part of our problem. And that's one of the reasons why we're going to try and break things down into 50 common causes, and there are many more, but 50 common causes that I've come across in many, many situations, in many forms. But essentially, we can boil it down to an essence. And remember, we're talking about a cause, not a symptom. We're talking about the root cause of what leads into a conflict developing, not just looking at the symptoms, the outward manifestation of that conflict. So, first of all, we're going to be looking at these personal issues and the emotional drivers, and we'll be taking them one at a time. What we do know is that we need to dive deep to work out what is the root cause, because if we address the causes of conflict, we can resolve that particular problem in the family between the individuals concerned and whoever their conflict touches for all time, or until the next time at least. If we don't address the causes and we only address the symptoms, then we'll put out that particular bushfire, but the cause will remain and it will erupt into another conflict or conflicts at some time in the future. Maybe soon, and it may be in the distant future, but it will happen, and that's what we are trying to avoid. We are attempting to end up with a family and a business running like a Swiss watch, and we need to eliminate the causes of conflict, or, like a cancer, if you cut it out and you don't get it all, it is going to continue ultimately to spread. Because we're dealing with human conflict, we are dealing fundamentally with humans, and humans are complicated things. They have a tendency to store things up, reason things out, badly, indifferently, sometimes very well. They are driven by a whole group of emotions, conditioning, genetics, which boil down a lot into their character and personality, which are themes that we will explore in a later episode. What we do know is that when we're dealing with conflict, we will traverse the entire range of human behaviors, of human characteristics, of human interactions, of human relationships. So this is going to be a pretty broad-ranging ride by the time we've gone through it all. And my experience has always been that when I have identified causes in a family, I'll often get the feedback to the effect that it's like you've been watching our family for the last 40 years. And that's because you can join the dots together when you've seen it often enough before. You can see where current behaviours have come from, how they might have been formed as you uncover the family story, get the narrative, get the history of the individuals. From the outside of the forest, from the helicopter looking down, you can see how one thing has led to another, to another, to another, and then ultimately created some sort of an explosion which manifests itself as a form of conflict. From the inside, it is very difficult for families to see this because they're a bit like a frog in boiling water. It's been what they're used to. The dynamic in the family is what they've been used to ever since childhood. They've grown up. It has been normalized in the family, whatever behaviors, whatever cultures exist within the family group, whatever has then been transported into the family business is what they've grown up with. It's normalized. And when they find that they don't have the emotional tools to equip them to deal with the problems and the pressures that arise in a work environment, no longer a social environment, that's when the conflict breaks out, and that's where the problems manifest based on what may well have happened back in the playroom 30, 40, 50 years earlier. Many families, therefore, are weighed down with emotional baggage, and they bring the baggage from the family into a business environment, which is an entirely inappropriate place to bring that baggage, and even more so, inappropriate as a forum in which to work out the implications and the resolution of the problems that come with that baggage. So what we're going to do is pick all this stuff apart, item by item, topic by topic, dig down, look at the causes, and then we're going to talk about what strategies can be adopted to prevent, avoid, manage, or resolve the problems that have arisen once and for all. Now, the emotional baggage I was talking about a moment ago can often be something that's been created by, let's call it misguided parenting, which is pretty common when you have entrepreneurial parents who have battled or been totally absorbed by the building of their business empire and creating their financial wealth. And in the process of putting their time, effort, energy, creativity, and everything else into growing the business, they haven't put enough of themselves into the family, or they may have put too much of themselves into the family. What do I mean by that? Well, either you may have a rampant entrepreneurial business leader determined to be ultra competitive and investing all their time and emotional energy into building their business. And if they have a spouse or a partner who supports them in the business, then there's nobody at home looking after the kids. If that spouse, or if the entrepreneur, or both, are not very emotionally intelligent and emotionally robust, their children are likely to end up without enough emotional support, emotional education, and as a consequence, they develop inadequate emotional resilience. And it's very, very common, it's a theme you'll hear many times during this series, of just how many entrepreneurs' families have been damaged, if not crippled, by the fact that in the process of building sometimes quite enormous wealth, the entrepreneur has set the bar so high, the kids will never feel adequate, will never feel they've satisfied that demanding parent or parents. And also, the kids simply see somebody out there acting as a warrior, slaying dragons non-stop, and they simply are a blowback byproduct of that person's life. They just happen to have become a biological issue, but the root cause of a lot of angst in the family is the belief of the children that the parent actually loves their business more than they love their own children. And that's a significant cause of problems, and we find it with an awful lot of entrepreneurial families that have spent money, made effort when it suits them, but have simply not had a consistent approach to really effective parenting. Another thing that tends to happen with entrepreneurial families is that they take the competitive nature of their activities in business back into the home. And they create a competitive environment with the kids. They encourage them to compete with each other, and they have a lot of praise for the winners, and they don't have a lot of sympathy for the losers. This, of course, is contrary to the fundamentals of having a good family, because families are about nurturing the weak, encouraging, celebrating the strong, but fundamentally celebrating being a family and the diversity within the family. These are not values that go down well in business. Business might like diversity, but that will be qualified by provided that diversity can be leveraged to business advantage. That is not a philosophy that belongs in a family environment. So what we do know is that when we're looking at emotional baggage, when we're looking at the family history, when we're looking at things that have gone wrong, we can't change it. What we can do is recognize what happened in the past. We can perhaps reflect on what we would have done differently with what we know now, or what we would have done differently if the circumstances had been different. It means we may not need to blame somebody for getting it all wrong, or some of it wrong, provided we can accept that their intentions were not malevolent at the very least, or may have been misguided, i.e. build wealth for the family to have good holidays, might be a better interpretation. But with an adult perspective, we can much more easily look at what went wrong in the past, and it may be something really quite trivial, and we look at it 40 years later, and I have an example in my first book called Who Poisoned the Goldfish? And in that particular story, we had a 46-year-old sister and a 48-year-old brother waiting to take over the business from the father. Very successful stationery printing publishing business. And both the brother and sister were pretty capable in their own right, but if left to their own devices in a business environment, they would disembowel each other with a blunt spoon from the cafeteria at a moment's notice. So Dad, who was very keen to scale back, hand the business over a period of a couple of years, he wasn't an old guy, he was still early 60s, take the success that he has built and go do some travelling, improve his golf handicap, do more fishing, all that usual stuff, spend more time with the grandkids and so forth. But he was very aware that if he left it to the two of them, they would destroy each other and destroy the business within 12 months because they had always fought like cat and dog, notwithstanding they were both working in very different parts of the business at this stage. When we took the whole situation to pieces, we discovered that when, let's call her Sally, was 6, Harry poisoned her much beloved goldfish called Snowy. And he did that by pouring bleach into the goldfish bowl, which made Snowy extremely snowy, certainly extremely white. When we went back through the family history, we arrived back at that event. And it created literally a primal scream, a howl, a fetal ball on the floor of recognition of something that had had an impact on the lives of both of them for 40 years. From the perspective of being adults, they were able to look back at that event, that childhood piece of sheer nastiness, and see it for what it was and recontextualize it. Once they were able to do that, they could accept, apologize, offer reparations, and understand how that event could have caused 40 years of antagonistic behaviour between the two of them. And in the context of both having a lot to gain by being able to work together and a great deal to lose by not being able to work together, they decided they were going to start working together again. So that's what I mean by taking the perspectives, looking at the context, finding a root cause in a very, very real sense, even though the psychs say whether that's a real cause of their antagonism or not, if they're happy to believe it and it's enough for them to change the way they feel about each other, not a change in the person, but changing the way they feel about each other, go with it because it works. So that's essentially what we're talking about here. We're talking about creating a situation where we unpack a conflict, because from within the family there is frequently a sense that this is hopeless, we can't deal with it, it's been here forever, we will never fix things, things will never improve, therefore give up hope, all ye who enter here. That's a pretty sad place to be. So we look to working out, what were the root causes, what are we going to do about it? What does this process look like? Well, it's sort of got elements of narrative mediation. It's got, I prefer to call it facilitation. But what it requires is somebody from outside of the family who's not emotionally involved, is not emotionally invested, to guide the family members through a series of revelatory conversations, if you like, that progressively unpeel, like the skins of an onion, unpeel where they've got to now by going back through their history of where it all started and then come back forwards again. So you cannot take the standard advisor approach of saying you can't change the past, therefore recognize what the problem is now and make a plan for the future. You have to, because it's a family, you have to unpack the past. You have to give a plausible explanation of why they're in the state they're in now, and then give them time to make a working accommodation that says, okay, recognizing what we got wrong, where we are now, what we need for the future, now we can finally start to move forward. And by the way, each of us will be watching the other to see whether or not the promises that we've made to be better in the future are actually promises that are kept. So we've given provisional trust, but it's going to take actual performance of promise to establish that trust and to maintain it. So from a dispute resolver's perspective, you've got to really hang loose. You've got to spend a lot more time uncovering the history before you try and solve any problems. And you really can't rush, nobody can rush in this process to a solution or solutions. You've got to unpack the situation first. I think of it as a deconstruction of the situation, spread the entrails across the table, poke them around, work out what you're going to get rid of, and then put it all back together again in a form that is going to be workable. That's our process. In that process, you've got to be very careful. If you are the facilitator, you've got to be careful to avoid confirmation bias, because the mores, the ethics, the feelings, the personalities of the family you're dealing with will not be exactly the same as yours. In fact, they may be very different. And they may be simply personality differences, they may be cultural or ethnic differences. What we have to be very, very careful of is that we don't find ourselves attempting to impose our own expectations of what is fair and reasonable on others. And very frequently in working with families to work through conflicts, we have arrived at outcomes which were entirely unpredictable and objectively make no sense. But they make entire sense for the individual. And one of the things I learned very early in my mediation career, going back 40 odd years, certainly well over 30 years, is that there is often a particular gesture or symbolic act or symbolic item which is of massive value to one party and of seemingly no or trivial value to almost everybody else. And frequently it's not, like it's often said, that, family business is all about the money. It hardly ever is in my experience. Yeah, the money's an issue, and the more money there is, the more likely people are to really get on the bandwagon and go chasing things. But it's not usually the cause. It might be an outcome, but it's not the cause. There will be something that is important to each individual if you can work out what that is and you can help the other people to ensure that the injured individuals get that thing as an outcome. And my classic example was somebody wanted grandma's China ducks, whereas the partner wanted the vintage Ferrari, which was sitting in pieces on the garage floor, and they were willing to trade the one against the other in a matrimonial separation. There was no talk about what their financial value was. This was emotional value to each, and they were prepared to just contra them off. Makes life easier when you can do that. So we need to avoid our confirmation bias. We need to make sure that what we are doing is working towards an outcome that works for the family and for the individuals in the family. When we're working through all this stuff, one of the key things we need to remember is that logic provides us with understanding, but emotion is what stimulates our feelings and encourages us to actually act, to do stuff. And whenever we're working in a resolution environment in a family business space, we need to be very aware that if what we do is work everything out perfectly, document the solutions, sign off, get everything witnessed, And we do that without engaging the emotional commitment of the parties. We'll come back 3 months or 3 years later, and that agreement will be sitting in a drawer and nothing will have happened. So our approach towards resolving family conflict must always be deal with the emotional blockers first, simply so you can have a rational conversation, have the rational conversation, work stuff out, and then at all times keep the emotional side of things engaged, and in the end make sure we have the emotional buy-in that means that the solutions that have been agreed will actually be the solutions that are kept. And I think of that as being a diversion from the standard advisor thing of here's the solution wrapped up in pink ribbon, technically correct, perfectly workable, everybody agrees. We are more negotiating the acceptance of what needs to be done to implement the solution. And that means we need to go beyond motivation, and we'll talk about this in more detail in future videos. We need to go beyond the motivation, the intent to do good or to fix things up, to activation, which is the initial steps of implementing the solution, and then on to the implementation after that. If we work stuff through in this environment and we don't get agreement to take the first steps to get things resolved, it won't work, guaranteed. I'll finish this off by talking about the Iceberg Principle. We all know that with an iceberg, the bit that sinks the ship is the 90% of the iceberg's mass that lies below the surface of the water. The bit at the top, the 10% that we can see above the surface, is what the ships can see and try to avoid. If they don't see it, they plough into the iceberg, and it's the mass of the whole thing that's going to destroy the ship. Similarly, with conflict, the stuff above the surface are the symptoms. I mentioned them earlier on in this video. Below the surface, we have grudges and disagreements that haven't yet been expressed, but people are not happy. Below that, we have the issues and the problems that have grown up to become grudges and disagreements and ultimately disputes and eventually conflicts. And sitting right at the very bottom of the whole iceberg, we have those root causes. So I think of it as a progressive build. Root cause at the bottom, holding everything down in the water. That generates, the root causes generate issues and problems, which, if they're not addressed, become grudges and disagreements, which burst out eventually into conflicts. So, in conclusion of this introduction to the very first section of these videos, I'd like to say it's not pure happenstance that has led me to choose personal issues and emotional drivers as a starting point. We will constantly be looking at these items, and the next series of videos will be exploring different aspects of those personal issues and emotional drivers, breaking them down one by one into bite-sized chunks. You don't need to listen to these videos in any particular order, but I have attempted to create some degree of sensible progression so that we start with the more broad and generic and then lead up into the more focused items. Each video will be coming out hopefully on a weekly basis, and I sincerely hope you can make use of them in avoiding, preventing, managing or resolving conflict in your family. And if you're unable to do it by yourself, feel free to get in touch with me, John Kempfield, at the Solutionist group in Melbourne. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back with another video in around a week's time. Thank you.